So recently, I did a video explaining how I organize all of my video projects so that I don't have to worry about losing anything in my gigantic stack of hard drives. And at the end of that video, I gave a little sneak peek of some automation I've been playing around with recently that lets me take advantage of that organization to dramatically speed up my editing workflow. My automation journey of sorts started when I was shown this 4-hour video titled World's Most Advanced Video Editing Tutorial by a guy called Taran van Hemert, aka the Macro King. In this video, he explains how he uses a free piece of coding software called Up Autohotkey to automate different parts of his workflow, from automatically applying effects to switching back and forth between different applications, and all kinds of other useful stuff. Once I understood the full potential of what could be done with Up Autohotkey, I, naturally, embarked on a relentless witch hunt to find all the little annoying, menial, repetitive parts of my workflow that I could automate away. And the first thing I zeroed in on was the sheer amount of time that I spend clicking through File Explorer windows to import assets into my project. That might not seem like a big issue if the work that you do basically consists of importing a whole bunch of footage, cutting it together, adding some titles, and rendering it out, but for the kind of work that I do, I am constantly downloading new images and music tracks from the internet, taking new screenshots or doing screen recordings, and then having to bring all that material in as I go to use in my edit. Honestly, I never really realized how much time gets taken up over the course of an edit by all this clicking. Especially once I stopped having to do it entirely. In this video, I'm going to show you step by step how to set up Up Autohotkey and how to write the two basic scripts that I just showed you in action a minute ago that are making my editing life much easier and more efficient. So, let's code. For those of you watching who are already familiar with Up Autohotkey and just want to get into the scripts, you can skip ahead to this timecode right here. For everybody else who is either new to Up Autohotkey or maybe even new to coding in general, here's a little bit of background. Up Autohotkey is a, quote, free open source scripting language for desktop automation. The basic idea is that it lets you automate pretty much anything within Windows by sending custom series of keystrokes or mouse clicks automatically. It can also run software, open specific web pages or folders, search for a specific color somewhere on your screen, and a whole bunch of other useful things too. Up Autohotkey hasn't actually been around for that long in the grand scheme of things. The first public beta was released in 2003, and it quickly became popular because the language is relatively easy to learn, and the features it offers are extremely powerful. People use it for everything from basic stuff like automatic email signatures or quickly inserting blocks of text that they use frequently, all the way up to running complex custom scripts. And when I say complex, I mean the sky is the limit, as long as you can write, or borrow, the code to make your automation dreams a reality. If you don't have Up Autohotkey installed, all you have to do is go to autohotkey.com, download the most up-to-date version, and, well, install it. Basic scripts can be written in regular old Notepad, and all you have to do for Up Autohotkey to be able to run them is change the file name extension from .txt to .ahk. Then you can run that script by just double-clicking on that file. Now, while that's all well and good, if you're serious about Up Autohotkey, it really does make sense to get a proper source code editor. The one I use is called Cite for Up Autohotkey. Notepad++ is another really popular option. That's actually what I was using originally. But I ended up switching to Cite for Up Autohotkey because, first of all, it comes pre-configured with Up Autohotkey syntax highlighting. With Notepad++, you need to download an extra plugin for that. And it also offers a couple of extra features that I think make it just a little bit nicer. I've included download links to both Cite for Up Autohotkey and Notepad++ in the description. Use whichever one you like best. Okay, now before we jump in, I do have one small disclaimer. I am not a software developer by trade. I am pretty good at writing code, but I am still learning the nitty-gritty of AutoHotkey. If you're watching this and you do write software for a living, you definitely know more about this stuff than I do, and I would love it if you could let me know down in the comments how I can make my code better. Alright, now that we got that out of the way, let's get to it. So this first script here is about as straightforward as an AutoHotkey script can get. What this does is it automatically creates the 5 folders that I use to organize all of my video projects. And the way it does it is by basically just mashing a whole bunch of keys in a specific order to actually create those folders and to name them all. It might not seem all that impressive, but if you think about it, would you rather, if I open up a test folder here, would you rather do this? Or this? So we're just going to delete those now, and the first thing we're going to do is just kind of walk through manually what is happening there, just so that we understand what we're about to automate. So in Windows, to create a new folder, there's already a keyboard shortcut for that. It's Control-Shift-N, and you can see I have a new folder here that's being created, and by default you can see that I can actually right away start typing the name that I want to give to that folder. So my first folder in my folder structure is called Assets, so I can type Assets, and then to commit that name, I just hit Enter. And there we go. You can see I have my Assets folder. If I want to make another one, all I have to do is hit Control-Shift-N again, give that a name as well. That folder is going to be called Documents, Enter, and there's my Documents folder. And same thing for the other 3 folders. So if we want to now automate that, we basically need to just create a program that does all of those key presses without us needing to actually press all of those keys. So what we're going to end up with is this, but what we're actually going to do for this video is we're just going to create a brand new script, and we're going to start from scratch so we can walk through it all step by step. The first thing I usually do with my programs, this is totally optional, is I just give them a little title header, just so that I know a little bit about what the program is supposed to be doing, and I can also reference when I wrote it and what version of the program I'm on. Okay, so now that's done. Like I said, that is totally optional and it doesn't affect how the program runs at all. This is just an organizational thing for me. If you're new to programming, this with the semicolons here is called commenting out a section. So this is not code that will run, it's a comment. There's ways in AutoHotkey to do, to comment out multiple lines without having to put this semicolon at the beginning of every line. I just do that because I think it looks nicer that way. I'm picky, what can I tell you? So now we're going to start writing the part of our program that actually does something. So the first thing we want it to do is to hit Control-Shift-N to create a new folder. And in AutoHotkey, the way we do that is we start by typing send, and that's the AutoHotkey command to send a keystroke or series of keystrokes. We put a comma, space, and for Control-Shift-N, what we do is we start with this little caret right here, or the hat, as it's sometimes called. You get that by hitting Shift and 6, and that is the AutoHotkey symbol for control. The AutoHotkey symbol for shift is the plus sign, so now we have Control-Shift, and we just hit N, and we now have Control-Shift-N. So now our program is going to hit Control-Shift-N for us, which means that we'll have a new folder created and ready for a name. So to give our folder a name, we're going to need a second send command right under that one. So we're going to go send again, comma, space, and we're going to tell AutoHotkey what we want it to name our folder. So you remember my first folder is called Assets, so I'm going to call it Assets. And then if you remember, the last thing we need to do for our folder to be completely created is to hit enter so that our folder name is committed and our folder exists on our drive. So we're going to need one last send command, and we're going to have that send command hit the enter key. Now, if I just write out the word enter like this, that's actually just telling AutoHotkey to type the word enter like that. If we want it to actually hit the enter key, we have to enclose our word enter in a set of curly braces, just like that. So now this command is going to actually hit the enter key. So what we have is Control-Shift-N typing out the word assets just like that, and then hitting enter. So that is going to create our folder, and that folder is going to be called assets. Now that we have something here that we can actually run, we want to assign that to run when we press a hotkey. And the hotkey that we're going to use for this is Control F9. Don't worry about why that's the case for now. I will talk about why it's usually a good idea to assign your scripts to run with some kind of outlandish hotkey. For now, just trust me. So to tell our script that we want this to run when we hit Control F9, we have to use our little caret or hat symbol there to say Control F9. Okay, so we're hitting Control F9. And then to assign this as a hotkey, we have to go colon, colon. And what that does is it says that Control F9 is going to be the hotkey that will run everything that is below it. So now we have a couple of lines of code that we can run. We have a hotkey that will tell that code when we want it to run. And now all we got to do is save our script here. So now that that is saved, one of the things that I really like about Cite for Autohotkey is that instead of having to navigate to where I just saved this script and double click on that file to run the script, there's actually this little button right here that if you press it, will actually run your script. And you can see down in the system tray right here, it just popped up, and that shows us that our script is running. So what we can do now is minimize these windows, and on our desktop, I'm gonna hit my hotkey, so Control F9, and you can see right over here, we just created a folder called what we wanted to call that folder. Pretty cool, huh? So at this point you might be thinking, well, cool, we're basically done, because all I gotta do is go back to my code here, copy that, and then go down here, paste it there, paste it there, paste it there, paste it there, and then change these names to whatever you want those folders to be called, and you're done, right? Well, actually, yes, you can do that, but that's a little bit lame. And there is a far, far, far more elegant way of doing that. In most programming languages, you can create something called a function. And basically what a function does is allow you to reuse a block of code as many times as you want in your program, but without having to actually recopy all of that code every time you want to use it. Instead, what you do is call that function. Another cool thing with functions is that they can usually accept some kind of input. So basically you can pass a piece of information through your function and have the code inside of it do something just with a different input every time you call the function. So in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to create a function that creates a new folder for us, and the input for that function is going to be whatever we want that folder to be called. So to create our function, the first thing we need to do is come up with a name for it. So I'm going to call it create folder, like that. And then we're going to add a set of parentheses. And in between those parentheses, we're going to come up with a name for our input variable. And you can think of a variable in programming as basically a bucket that will hold on to a piece of information so that you can use it later on in your program. So in this case, I'm going to call my variable folder name, since the input that our function will take is going to be whatever we want to call our folder. So to make this a function, we're going to add curly braces. You're going to see curly braces are going to be a recurring theme in this. So one goes right here after we define our function, and the other one goes here at the end. And then what we're going to do is we're going to take all of this, hit tab so that it is indented. So the last thing we need to do now for our function to be complete is to actually make use of this variable here. So on our second send command, we're going to get rid of assets, and we're going to instead say that this is going to be whatever is contained in the folder name variable. Now, this won't work, at least not yet, because to retrieve the contents in our variable, we actually have to enclose the variable's name in percentage signs like that. So now what this is saying is that the second send command here is going to retrieve whatever is in folder name and then type that out. And that is our function. So it's called this. It takes an input called this, it hits Control-Shift-N, it types out whatever the input was, and then it hits enter. So we've created our function. If we want to use it, we now need to call it. And the way we call a function in AutoHotkey is like this. So we type out the name of our function, parentheses, okay? And then in between the parentheses, we put in whatever we want to pass pass through our function. So this is what's going to be held inside our folder name variable, and it's going to be what our resulting folder that our function is creating is going to be called. So we're going to call our first folder assets, and for this to work, you'll realize there's a lot of enclosing in different things in AutoHotkey. For this to work, this needs to be recognized as what's called a literal string. Basically, that just means that it's a piece of actual text, and for this to be recognized as a string, we put it in between quotation marks like that. So now this is telling AutoHotkey that we want to use the actual word assets and pass that through our function. Now that that's done, we can save our script here again. We can run it, and you'll see we get this little message box right here that says that we're trying to replace the current instance, because remember, the first version of this script that we already ran is still running. You can use the single instance command at the top of your code. A lot of people do that so that you don't get this message. If you find that annoying, you can decide that you don't want to see it anymore. This is maybe a little unconventional, actually like having this message box pop up because it basically just confirms that yes, I am indeed running a fresh instance of my code. That's up to you if you want that or not. But anyways, we're gonna hit yes, and that means that the new version of our code is now running. If we get rid of this and go back to our desktop, and I'll actually get rid of the assets folder that we created last time, and then I'm gonna hit Control F9 again, and you see, we just created another folder called assets. And at this point you might be thinking, okay, well great, that was a lot of work for nothing. We already had that. Here's where the magic happens. So if we go back to our code here, instead of having to reuse all of these lines of code every time we want to create a new folder, all we have to do is call our function again, and in the parentheses, we just put whatever we want the name of our second folder to be. So now we're going to be creating two folders. We can actually test that by saving, running our code again. Yes, we want to run a new instance. And then we can go back to our desktop, get rid of that, hit Control F9. And now you can see it made it picked a weird spot to put them, but we just created our two folders, assets, documents. And you can see where this is going. For the rest of our folders, we're just going to copy that like that. Change the names of our last three folders. By the way, this is just what I like to use. If you have a different folder structure and your folders are called different things, obviously just substitute in the names of the folders that you like to use and it'll work exactly the same way. But now we've got our 5 folders that are going to be created. We're going to save that one more time, run a fresh instance one more time, get rid of those, hit Control F9. And in an order that frankly doesn't make any sense to me, but whatever, we have all 5 of our folders all created for us, and all we had to do was hit one hotkey. Pretty fun. Okay, now before we get too excited, there are 2 more small little things that we need to add to our code before we can call it a day. The first one is a slight delay in between each one of those folders being created. And the reason why we need that is because I just showed you this on my desktop, which is writing to a blazing fast NVMe drive. If you're doing this on a slower hard disk drive that has to physically write the data and create those new folders on a mechanical spinning platter, you might run into an issue, and I did run into this quite a bit when I was testing this script. You'll run into an issue where the drive won't actually have time to write the name of a folder before the code starts trying to create the next folder. And what happens then is that you only end up with partial folder names actually getting typed out, and it just looks really weird. So the way we counteract that is by building in a sleep command. And we're going to put it in at the end of our function here. So we're going to add one more line. We're going to type sleep, comma, space, 500. And this is in milliseconds, so 1/1000th of a second. So what we've just said here is pause. Sleep basically tells AutoHotkey to pause before continuing to run the code for half a second. And the cool thing is, because we put this inside of our function, it's going to run at the end of each one of these function calls. So basically what we've done there is build in a half-second buffer in between each one of those folders getting created. You can play around with this for yourself. If you can get away with less of a delay or even no delay, depending on what kind of hard drive or solid-state drive you're using, go for it. Based on my testing, this half-second delay is just enough so that on even the slowest drives, the drive actually has time to create the folder before the script starts trying to create the next one. Now, the second little thing that we need to add to our program is we need to prevent it from running in anything other than a Windows File Explorer window. And the reason we need to do that is, if you think about it, you wouldn't want to accidentally set off this huge chain of key presses when you're like typing an email or something. So the way we do that is at the very top of our code, we're going to go hashtag or # or whatever you want to call it, if win active, and you can see that just turned blue with the AutoHotkey syntax highlighting here because this is a built-in command in AutoHotkey. We're going to go ahk_class cabinet w class. So what that just did is tell everything below this command in the script that it can only run if the active window is a Windows File Explorer window. Now, you might well be wondering where all of this total gibberish comes from. Well, AutoHotkey comes with a really interesting little tool called Window Spy. I have a hotkey built in to call it up. This is what it looks like. You can find it, though, if you don't have that hotkey under, oh boy, now I gotta remember where this actually is. Program Files, AutoHotkey, Window Spy. There it is. Okay, so you have Window Spy running. Basically, what Window Spy will do is allow you to, well, spy on Windows. You can see right now I have Site for AutoHotkey selected as the active window, and you can see that AHK class is Site window. If I go to my File Explorer window that I have back here, aha! AHK class, cabinet W class. So this is AutoHotkey's way, and I don't know why this is the case, but this is AutoHotkey's way of saying File Explorer window. So what our AHK cabinet W class command is saying is that unless the active window says, hey, I am AHK class cabinet W class, nothing below that line is going to work. And we can actually save our script here again, get rid of Window Spy, run this again, and test that out. So we're back on our desktop here, and you remember earlier the code was running here, but now if I hit my hotkey, I can hit that as many times as I want, it's not going to do anything. But now if I open up my test folder here, this now is a cabinet W class window that is open. So if I hit my hotkey now, aha! It's alive. If I go back to my desktop, not alive. So there we go. That is our complete instant folder structure script. And if that's the first AutoHotkey script you've ever written, congratulations. And the cool thing is that now that we've got the basics down, writing our next script is going to be a lot easier. This script is easily the biggest time saver I've created for myself with AutoHotkey so far. While the last script that we just made is pretty cool, at the end of the day, it's kind of a novelty, and you really only use it once over the course of a project. This will seriously save you some time over the course of putting together a video. You can see here, this is version 4.0 of this particular script. Don't ask. But basically what this does is allow me to open up any one of those 5 folders that I use to organize all of my video projects with one hotkey. And you can see all those hotkeys are set down here at the bottom. And basically what that means is that there is no more clicking through File Explorer to get to my project folder to import new material into Premiere Pro. I just hit the hotkey for the folder I want and it's there. Let me show you here how this actually works. So I'm gonna run this now, minimize that. And you see the first part of this is a little input box right here. And what goes in this entry field is the file path for the project folder that I'm currently working in. And to show you as an example here, I'm going to use the project folder for my recent review of the GitUp Git 2. So what I do is I just click into that folder. You can see there's my 5 standard folders. And then to get the file path, all you actually have to do is click once up here, And you can see there's the complete file path, and it's already highlighted. So all you got to do is hit Control-C, go back to my input box here, paste that, hit OK, and you can see I've got a little message box here that says I've set my active folder. And now that that's set, I can use the other hotkeys that are set up as part of that same script to individually call up any one of those 5 folders. Pretty awesome. Another cool component of this is that when all those folders are open, every time I hit the hotkey for one of them, it doesn't open a new instance of it, it actually just brings that to the top. And you can see you can actually zip through them awfully fast. This is really, really useful when you're editing and you go, okay, I need that piece of music I just downloaded, for example. Instead of having to go into File Explorer, click through to the folder where you're storing your music, or arguably worse still, keeping all of those folders open, the windows tend to get a little cluttered down there, all I actually have to do is hit the hotkey for my music folder, and there it is. All I have to do if I want to use, say, this piece of music is drag it in, and now I can use it in my edit. So now if we take a look at the script that actually makes all that happen, it might look a little bit daunting. Don't worry though, we're going to go through it step by step so it'll all make sense, and honestly it's really not as complicated as it might seem. So same as last time, we're going to start with a new document here. We're going to give it the same little descriptive title header. Again, this is completely optional and does not change one thing about how the script will actually run. But now, the first thing in our script that we're going to write that is actually going to run is we're going to create our input box. And the input box is a built-in GUI element in AutoHotkey that basically lets us type in an input and store it in a variable so that we can then use it in our program. In our case, this is how we're going to tell our script what folder we want it to be working in. So to create that input box, we're going to type input box. We're going to come up with a name for the variable that's going to store whatever it is that we type into our input box. I'm going to call mine directory name. The next thing that we're going to need to specify is what we want the title of our input box to be. Mine is going to be set active project folder. Then we need to put in the prompt. So this is the text that's going to appear above the actual input field. My prompt is going to be enter active project folder and a colon at the end like that. Then we're going to put 2 commas. And then here we're going to specify the dimensions that we want our input box to be. If you don't specify any dimensions, AutoHotkey will just make the box whatever size it deems appropriate based on the number of characters in your title and your prompt. But I think we covered this earlier. I'm kind of picky. So I'm going to tell AutoHotkey that I specifically want my input box to be 300 pixels by 130 pixels. And then I'm going to put 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 commas, and then directory name, so the name of my variable that's containing the text that I'm putting in my input box, and I'm going to enclose it in percentage signs. Don't worry too much about what that's doing for the moment. All will become clear soon. Just for now, make sure that what you have looks exactly like this with this exact number of commas, no more, no less, because we want to make sure that what we are typing in here is actually corresponding to the correct parameters of AutoHotkey's input box function. So the next thing we need to do is assign a hotkey to our input box so that we can call it up when we need it. And the hotkey I'm going to use for this is Control. So remember, Shift-6 gets us this little caret symbol here, numpad 0. And remember to assign a hotkey, we go colon, and now Control numpad 6 is going to call up our input box. And we can actually test that now. We're just going to save our script. And now we can run it. And if we hit Control numpad 0, you can see there is our input box, and you can see it corresponds exactly to what we specified up here. So that's our title, that's our prompt, and it is 300 pixels wide by 130 pixels tall. The next thing we need to do is set up the hotkeys that are going to open each one of the standard folders that are in the project folder that we're going to point our script at. So the first one of these is going to be control numpad 1. And remember, colon, colon, so we're assigning a hotkey. And what this hotkey is going to do is run. We're going to call up our directory name variable, because remember, this is going to contain the file path that will direct our script to the active project folder. So directory name. And to be able to extract what's contained in that variable, we want to enclose it in percentage symbols. And we're not quite done here, because we don't just want to open the file path of our project folder. We want to open a specific folder inside that project folder. And to do that, after our directory name variable, we're going to add a slash, and then we're going to type the name of our first folder, which in my case is assets. And since we have 5 folders, we're going to take this line of code, copy it, and paste it 4 more times. And then we're going to change all of these to number pad 2, 3, 4, and 5. And we're going to change the name of the folders that each one of these hotkeys is accessing to correspond to the 5 folders that I use. Same as before, if you have your own folder structure that you like to use with different folders that have different names, obviously substitute those in for what I have here. If you have more folders than I do, you can continue to add more hotkeys below here. So control number pad 6, control number pad 7, and so on. Or if you have fewer, you can just have fewer hotkeys. But anyway, basically, we're done.
Huh?
Okay, not really. You can see if we save our script and run a new instance of it, it will actually work perfectly. We can use the same folder that we had before, copy that file path, use control number pad 0 to get our input box, paste that file path in there, hit OK, and now if I use my control number pad 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 hotkeys, I can actually open up all of those folders. And you can see it's nice and snappy, it's working perfectly. Everything is right with the world. Sort of. You can see if I run another fresh instance of this script, but instead of using the input box, I just start hitting the hotkeys to open up the individual folders, I start getting attacked by a whole bunch of really ugly looking error messages. And you can see if we take a closer look at one of these, the reason why we're getting them is because our program doesn't actually know what folder it's looking for, because our directory name variable is blank because we didn't type anything into our input box. So our program is actually looking for, in this case, a folder called raw footage, but it doesn't know where that folder is actually supposed to be. So it just tries a whole bunch of things and then basically errors out. Now, in all honesty, we could just live with this. I mean, the script is still running, so you can just get rid of these error messages, use your input box, type in your file path, and then it'll work. But if we're gonna do this, we might as well do it right. So what we now have to do is tell our program under which circumstances we want those hotkeys to actually be active. And the first part of this is that we want all of our hotkeys to be off by default when we run our script. So in AutoHotkey, this is actually pretty easy to do. We're going to go to the top of our script here, and to set a hotkey to be off, we just use the hotkey function, comma. We use the name of our hotkey. So number pad 0 we're going to leave alone because we want control numpad 0 to bring up our input box at all times. But control number pad 1 we are going to set to off, and that's it. Now, control number pad 1 is off. And to do the same for the rest of our hotkeys, we're going to copy this line of code, paste it 4 more times, change this to number pad 2, 3, 4, 5, and just like that, all of our hotkeys are off. We can save our script, run a new instance, and now I can hit all of those hotkeys. I'm holding down control here. I can hit all 5 of those hotkeys and they won't do anything. The input box still works, but none of the other hotkeys will do anything, which is kind of a problem because none of those hotkeys will do anything ever unless we start specifying certain circumstances under which those hotkeys will actually be switched on. And to do that, we're going to use a series of if-else statements. If you're new to coding, don't worry if this sounds a little bit complicated. The logic is actually pretty straightforward, and you'll realize it starts to sound a little bit as though you were just verbally describing what your program is doing. So our if-else statements are going to live underneath our input box here, so we're going to make a little bit of room. And basically in this space, it's actually going to be a lot bigger than this, but in this space we need to deal with 4 distinct possibilities, because there are 4 things that could happen as a result of us calling up our input box. The first one is what happens if we actually type in a real file path into our input box like we're supposed to. The second one is what happens if we hit cancel on our input box, because we do need our program to be able to deal with that possibility. Third is what happens if we type nothing into our input box, but we still hit OK. And fourth and final, we need our program to be able to deal with us typing something into that input box that isn't actually a real file path, because we already know that if our script goes looking for a file or folder that doesn't actually exist, Autohotkey will aggressively let us know that we screwed up. So the first thing we're going to do to our code here is actually take all of this and put it down here. Because the way hotkey assignments work in Autohotkey, if you're only running one line of code with that hotkey, you can put it all on one line like that, and it'll work just fine. But as a result of our input box here, we're actually going to be asking our script to go through many lines of code. And when that's the case, the one line thing doesn't work anymore, and you actually need to tell Autohotkey when the script that is running as a result of this hotkey is going to end. We're going to touch on that in just a second. The first thing we're going to do is write our first if statement. And that first if statement is going to deal with what happens when we hit cancel on our input box. And the way we can tell if we hit cancel is by using the input box's built-in error level function. Now, error level gets set to a different value depending on how you interacted with the input box. If you hit cancel, error level gets set to 1. So in our code here, we're going to write if error level equals 1. Remember, I said this was going to sound a lot like speech. We're going to add a set of curly brackets like that. And in between those curly brackets, we're just going to put the word return. And you remember I was saying that when a hotkey is running multiple lines of code, we need to say when we want that hotkey to stop looking for more stuff to run. Well, the word return is how we do that. So basically what we've just said here is if you hit cancel on that input box, don't do anything, and don't wait around for any more instructions. So that is our first statement. Our second statement, which is going to follow directly below it, is going to deal with, I guess, the good one of our 4 possibilities. It's going to switch our hotkeys on if what we entered in our input box corresponds to an actual folder that actually exists on one of our hard drives. So what we're going to write here is, on a new line, else if. So basically what we're saying here is if this doesn't happen, but whatever is going to go here does, file exist. And this is pretty handy because what this is doing is checking if whatever follows it is actually a file or folder that exists, a set of parentheses, and in between those parentheses, we're going to use our variable name. So what this is going to do is check if whatever we put into our input box, because remember, whatever we type in gets stored in this variable, so this is going to check if that input corresponds to a file, or in our case, folder, that actually exists on our system. Then what we're going to do is we're going to add our curly brackets once again, kind of like that. And then under here is where we're going to say what we want to happen if our input into our input box actually corresponds to a folder that actually exists. And obviously what we want to happen in that case is we want our hotkeys to be switched on. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to grab these 5 lines of code from up here. We're going to copy them with Control-C, and we're going to paste them right there. And we just got to make sure that they're all properly indented, get rid of that extra space. And then you can probably see where this is going, where it says off at the end of each one of these lines. Well, we're going to switch that to on. And actually, once that's done, we're going to add one more line, so I actually shouldn't have gotten rid of that blank space, and we're going to add return. So what this is saying is, if this is the case, turn all the hotkeys on, and then terminate this hotkey. There is one small little optional thing that I add into my code here. You remember earlier when I said that I liked having the single instance message box pop up just to confirm that I'm actually running a new instance of my script? Well, here what I do is I actually add a message box. We need 2 commas here. The title of that message box says active folder set. And the text that's going to be displayed by that message box is going to say active folder, colon, and then inside of percentage symbols, the name of my variable, which is whatever I input into my input box, and then that times out after 2 seconds. The reason I put that there is just because I like having that visual confirmation that, yes, indeed, I have set my active folder, yes, my hotkeys are on, and here's what I've actually set as my active folder. Again, that's totally optional. I like having it there, but if you think that's extra clutter, you can just get rid of that line of code and everything will work just fine. In either case, though, we now actually have something that we can test. But before we do, I just realized I made one small little goof. This needs to actually be in parentheses. Whoops. Otherwise, your code won't actually work. But now that that's corrected, we can save our code, run a fresh instance of it, just minimize that, and then you can see if I hit Control number pad 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, none of those hotkeys result in those ugly error messages from earlier. But my input box still works. I can grab my... Oop, I closed it. I didn't plan that. That was actually an inadvertent demonstration of why this script is so useful. All that annoying clicking after I accidentally closed that window doesn't need to happen. But anyway, now that I have the folder back that I want to use to test here, I can copy my file path, paste that into my input box, hit OK. My message box will tell me that I've set my active folder to that. That went away after 2 seconds. And now, if I use my control number pad 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 hotkeys, you can see that they all work. Pretty cool, huh? Now, unfortunately, if I use my input box again and I type in nothing this time and I hit OK, well, now I start getting all kinds of errors again. Or if I try bringing up my input box again and pasting in my file path, but say I make a typo, well, that's also no good. So now we're going to deal with those 2 possibilities. So back in our code here, we're going to make another else if statement. So what we're saying now is if not that, and also not that, but this, do this, which is what's going to follow underneath our else if. And we're going to go else if, in parentheses, directory name, so that's the name of our input box's variable, equals, quote, quote. So what we're actually checking for here is if our directory name variable contains nothing, so that's if we didn't type anything into our input box and then still tried to hit OK, then we're going to add our, by this point, familiar curly brackets like that. And then in here, what we want to say is that if directory name equals nothing, we want our script to set all of our hotkeys to off. What we could do is just copy all these lines of code under here, and that would work. But remember that there are ways that we can reuse blocks of code in our script without having to retype them all. In our last script, we used a function to do that, but this time around, we're actually going to use something called a subroutine. And the main reason we're using a subroutine this time instead of a function is that we don't actually need to pass any information through it. We literally just want to reuse those same lines of code. But before we can use our subroutine, we first have to define it. And the way we're going to do that is go back to the very top of our code right here, above all 5 of our hotkey off commands. We're going to give our subroutine a name. So I'm calling it all off. And then we're going to add a single colon. And you can see that that just became boldface. So this is now called, it's called the label, but this is now the name of our subroutine. The last thing we need to do to make this complete is to say where our subroutine ends. So below our 5th off statement, we're going to add the word return. And what that's saying is that this subroutine ends here. So our subroutine basically comprises these 5 lines of code. Now, one small note here, usually things like functions and subroutines will actually live at the bottom of your script. You might have noticed on the last script that we made, our create folder function was actually at the bottom of our script. The reason why that's the case is because you don't want to be scrolling past all your functions and subroutines every time you want to make little adjustments to the part of the code that is actually calling those functions to actually do stuff. In this case, though, we're actually going to leave this right where it is at the top of our script, because if we were to grab it and move it to the bottom, what would happen is that all of our hotkeys would no longer be set to off at the beginning of our script. So basically, we would just be going right back to where we were before we wrote these 5 lines of code, with those ugly error messages popping up if we hit any of these hotkeys before typing something into our input box. So in this case, this is actually where this belongs. But anyway, now that we have defined our subroutine, we're now going to call it under our second else if statement. We're going to write go sub, comma, and then the name of our subroutine, so all off, and that's it. It's honestly that simple. So instead of having these 5 lines of code, we did all of that with just that one little line of code there. We're going to round this out with the word return underneath, and that's to terminate our hotkey. And the optional message box here is going to be titled hotkeys off. And the text in that message box is going to explain why that's the case. So it's going to say entry field blank, because we didn't type anything into our input box. And it's going to time out after 2 seconds. I'm just going to get rid of this extra space there. And we're good. So basically now we have a statement that deals with hitting cancel on the input box. We have a statement that turns all of our hotkeys on if we type something in that is a real file path. We have a statement that deals with trying to type nothing into our input box and hitting OK. And the last scenario we need to deal with is what happens if we type in literally anything else. So not nothing, but also not a real file path that exists on our system. This part kind of reminds me of an intro to computer science class that I took when I was in grade 11. I really loved that class. We learned all about stuff like Boolean algebra and how stuff like hexadecimals work. And by the end, we were actually writing basic little programs in another really popular programming language called Python. I did pretty well in that class, and I remember every time the teacher would come to check my work when I'd finished one of our little assignment programs, if the program took a user input, what he would do was mash the keyboard with his palm and hit enter and see what happened. And usually what happened is the program crashed because it didn't know what to do with that giant string of random characters. So I learned pretty quickly that good programs have to be able to deal with inputs that aren't useful. In our case here, that's going to be literally anything that doesn't correspond to a real file path that exists on our system. So we're going to add one more statement at the bottom here, and it's going to start with else and just else, because basically what we're saying here is if none of this other stuff is true, so if we didn't hit cancel, if what we typed in isn't a real file path, and if we didn't try and type in nothing and hit OK, in that case, we're going to add some curly braces here. We're going to use our same subroutine from here. We can actually just copy it directly, paste that there. So we're setting all of our hotkeys to off. We're going to add a return below that to terminate our hotkey. And our optional message box here is going to be titled hotkeys off. And again, our body text is going to explain why that's the case. This time it's going to say invalid file path, and that box is going to time out after 2 seconds. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is it. So let's run our script here and see how it works. We're going to save our script. We're going to run a fresh instance of it. We can minimize Site for Auto Hotkey. So first of all, we can see that all of our folder hotkeys are off by default. That's good. Our input box still works just fine. So first thing, if we hit cancel, that just goes away. And all of our hotkeys are still off. If we bring that input box back and we plug in the same file path we've been using to test, hit OK. Yeah, okay, that tells us that our active folder is set and what it's set to, and all of our hotkeys are on and they work perfectly. If we bring our input box back again, okay, you can see here, it has actually remembered the last thing that I typed in. And the reason why we have that is if you cast your mind all the way back to the very first line of code we wrote for this program, it had that weird directory name call way at the end after those 5 commas. Well, that's what it's doing. This is actually displaying the last value that was assigned to the directory name variable. Kind of handy. But anyway, now what we want to do is we want to basically type this in wrong, so I'm just going to delete the last 2 letters, try and hit OK and see what will happen. Okay, invalid file path, my hotkeys are off, and yeah, they are well and truly off. None of those buttons work. We're going to bring that back, and we're just going to mash a whole bunch of keys, hit OK, invalid file path, that's good, as it should be. And just to kind of cap this all off, we're gonna see if I can actually find the original folder here. We're gonna copy this file path again. We're gonna paste in a real file path, hit OK. Yes, we've set an active folder, and all those hotkeys work again. So, if that's working for you, congratulations. You just wrote a, I think, fairly legit little script. And more importantly, your editing life just got way easier. Now, there is one last little note here before we leave off this script. This code will work perfectly as long as you have all 5 of those folders in your project folder, or as long as you have whatever folders you're using and that your script is trying to call up. But you'll remember, if you saw my last video where I explained the folder structure that I use, I sometimes have projects that don't actually need all 5 of those folders. And if that's the case, and you accidentally hit the hotkey that's trying to open that non-existent folder, you will get an error message. That's why I'm now actually using version 4.1 of this script. Everything is exactly the same except for under each one of the folder hotkeys, where I've added an extra file exist function that checks whether that folder actually exists before trying to open it. If that particular folder doesn't exist, its corresponding hotkey just does nothing. If you want to add this functionality to your version of this script, all you have to do is copy those lines of code and paste them over where all those individual run commands are now, and that'll work perfectly. The only reason I'm not including a full walkthrough of this little addition in this video is because, well, 1, this video is getting pretty long already, and 2, it's not quite perfect yet. You can see this portion of the script is actually pretty inefficient in that it reuses the same lines of code over and over again. Ideally, I'd be doing this with a function, but I have to be able to pass 2 variables through that function, and while this is something that AutoHotkey lets you do, I've only been able to get it mostly working so far. So this works fine for now, but a more sophisticated version of this script is still a work in progress. And that's probably one of the most important things to remember about AutoHotkey and writing custom scripts like this. None of this stuff is ever going to be anything close to a polished, finished product. It is a giant tinkerer's playground, and it always will be, and stuff like this is pretty much doomed to being a perpetual work in progress. So just keep that in mind before you venture too far down the AutoHotkey rabbit hole. However, if you're like me and this is something you want to do, as I promised earlier, I'm going to end this video by finally explaining why we've been assigning all of our hotkeys to such crazy key combinations. This is especially important to keep in mind if you're planning on getting really into AutoHotkey, since there are some best practices to keep in mind if you want to prevent all your scripts from basically giving you a gigantic headache. Okay, so here's why you have to use ridiculous, unusual key combinations for your hotkeys. Basically, as soon as you set up a key or series of keys as a hotkey inside a script, as long as that script is running, you can't actually use those keys for anything else. That's why in the scripts that we just made, I used Control F9 and Control number pad 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 instead of just the function key on its own or the number pad keys on their own. If I had done that, not only would I run the risk of accidentally running my script if I were to hit one of those keys by mistake, I also wouldn't be able to, say, use my number pad to, type numbers anymore, which would be kind of stupid. Now, I realize that this might be kind of obvious for a lot of people, but I thought it was important to at least mention it because I feel like this is a mistake that some people might unwittingly be making. Case in point is this video here that's about how to remap Premiere keyboard shortcuts using AutoHotkey. You can see that the Macro King himself actually weighed in the comments and pointed out why remapping keys unwisely is a bad idea. So, based on the very good information in that comment, here are a couple basic rules by which to live your AutoHotkey life. First, don't write a script unless you have to. The idea of AutoHotkey is to give your software functionality that it doesn't already have. If the program you're using, say Premiere for example, already allows you to set up a keyboard shortcut for something, just set up the keyboard shortcut in the program. It's just better that way. And second, and while we're on the topic of specific applications, as much as possible, try to write your scripts so that they only run when the application they're designed for is also running. You remember we did that with the first script that we wrote by using if_when_active so that it only works if a file explorer window is the active window. If you don't do this, you might start to find your computer developing a HAL-like mind of its own, with scripts running here, there, and everywhere seemingly of their own volition. You don't want that. Remember, hotkeys and scripts like this are incredibly powerful. Their potential is pretty much only limited by your imagination, and the few seconds here and there that they save you can add up to, and I'm not exaggerating here at all, hours over the course of just a few weeks of work. But they're only useful if they come in addition to the functionality that Windows and the software you're using already offer, not at the expense of it. Now, don't worry though, because you're not necessarily doomed to a life of hitting crazier and crazier key combinations as your inventory of scripts expands. Even for the scripts that we just made, when I use them, I don't actually press Control number pad 0, Control number pad 1, and so on to run them. Or at least I don't press those keys myself. What I actually do is I have a secondary programmable macro keypad, and the keys on it are configured to virtually press the hotkeys that run my scripts. You might also have some macro keys on your keyboard that you can set up to do the exact same thing in the companion software for your keyboard. Yet another thing that you can do is get a whole other keyboard and set it up to be a huge macro keypad. I've actually linked to a Terran Van Hemert video where he explains exactly how you can do that. Ultimately, if you're really serious about using macros and scripts to speed up your workflow, some kind of additional keypad is probably a good idea. If you like the look of the one that I have, stay tuned because I'll be doing a full review of it in the very near future. And with that, you're pretty much all set to start speeding up your workflow with code. You've already got a couple of basic scripts to get you started, and the online documentation for AutoHotkey is really thorough and very easy to search, so you should have no problem at all starting to create your own custom scripts to automate your own unique workflow. Just consider yourself warned, writing code like this can get awfully addictive awfully fast. If you're already hooked, I hope you enjoy the many, many, many hours that you won't be able to help spending creating your very own scripts. Well, I hope this video didn't melt your brain too much. If you liked it, hit like, get subscribed, hit the little bell so you get notified when new videos come out, and let me know down in the comments if you found this video useful or if you have ideas for other video editing related topics you might like to see me cover on this channel. But that's all for now. Thank you very much for watching. I've been Alexander. Until next time, goodbye.